So thank you all for coming. Yate 시대나 시니시대 동네 시대를 주시고다 나타나는 사건에 얼굴에 가다 우리에게 마시기 때문에. Hi, I'm Will. I am a 1L and I'm Navajo and Blackfeet. I'll be co-moderating this panel today with Marissa.
And I'm Marissa. I'm a 2L. I'm one of the tribe presidents of the Native American Law Students Association. I'm Choctaw and Cherokee, and we are really excited to have you all here to celebrate 50 years of NALSA with three amazing alumni, Native SLS alumni here, who will be reflecting on these past 50 amazing years. We will start with some introductions and then get into some questions.
So I will first introduce Judge Sunshine Sykes. The Honorable Judge Sunshine Sykes graduated from Stanford University in 1997 and Stanford Law School in 2001. Judge Sykes is a member of the Navajo Nation and began her legal career working for California Indian Legal Services. Judge Sykes has served in a number of public service roles since then at the state and federal level, where she used her expertise in the Indian Child Welfare Act to advance child welfare and tribal sovereignty. Most recently, Judge Sykes was confirmed by the Senate in 2022 to the Central District of California Court in Riverside. She was the first Native American federal judge in California. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Rick West. Rick West graduated from Stanford Law School in 1971. He's a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma. Rick began his legal career representing Native clients at both big law and Indian law firms. Rick then pivoted to work as a founding director at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. Rick continued his career at the Autry Museum of the American West and remains an outstanding Native advocate and ambassador, and we are excited to hear Rick's perspective.
And last but not least, we have Brett Lee Shelton, who graduated from Stanford Law School in 1996. He's enrolled in the Oglala Lakota tribe and began his legal career working in private practice and for nonprofits, focused on domestic violent responses, genetic research, and Indigenous peoples and Indian health policy. Brett currently serves as a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund, also known as NARC. He also writes extensively about peacemaking and Indian health policy and has served as a judge in several tribal courts of appeals.
So I guess to overview the panel, we've prepared some questions. So we'll start with those and then we'll open it up to folks in the audience if you all have anything in particular you want to ask. But I guess to get us started, to ask all three of our panelists, what motivated you to attend law school? And in your time, I guess, in law school and since, how has the law in your eyes changed, especially how has Indian law and tribal law changed to you?
Are we beginning left or right?
Sure.
Okay. I would answer that by saying this. I didn't come post-undergraduate straight to law school. I actually went first to graduate school. I was going to get a PhD in American history from Harvard. And I decided after about 3 months of that was the wrong decision. And I switched course at that point and decided to go to law school. And the reason I did that is because I was looking for some kind of pursuit that I felt could produce systemic change, systemic social change. That's the contribution that I felt I could make in a larger context, or at least try to make in a larger context to Native America. And so that is what sent me toward law school. It was the mid-60s. Quite frankly, when lots of people sitting in this room and even on this panel were not even born. It was a very different time, and I wanted to be closer to the barricades, if you will, of Native legal reform, and I saw the courts as one of those avenues that one could use. So I did do that, and I would just say that what that gave me was a sense of one piece of the system that could be used as a vehicle for change and progress, the law. But what it also taught me was to always be on the lookout for other pieces of systemic change that could occur. And that, quite frankly, is how I explain also my exit from practicing law. Because my career was basically two halves. One half was practicing law, both with, in the beginning, a large firm in Washington, D.C., that had been founded by Felix Cohen, and some consider sort of the father of modern Indian law. Then moving on from the practice of law to being the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, which again presented a huge piece of the system that somehow needed to be changed in very systemic ways in order to make things right that historically had been wrong. I'll leave it for there for the moment.
You want me to go? I can go. Well, I think going back even further for me, I really always wanted to be a lawyer and then a judge from when I was very little. I was born on the Navajo Reservation in Tuba City, Arizona. But then my mother worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and ended up getting transferred from DC to Gallup, New Mexico. And Gallup, New Mexico was at the time, and probably still is to some extent, it was just a really hard town. There was a lot of poverty there, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of racism. It's a border town to the Navajo Reservation, so there's no alcohol allowed on the reservation. So there's a lot of bars there. And so I grew up in that environment with my mother. We didn't have a lot, so oftentimes we had to walk. We didn't have a car. So just different struggles and different experiences I had with her. But on the other hand, my father, who is non-Indian, lived in big cities like LA or New York, and I would go to visit him sometimes in the summer. And so when I was with my father, I saw, how I was treated a lot differently than I was with my mother. When I was with my dad, I saw how, people actually listened to him when he spoke, acknowledged him, saw him, heard him. But then when I was with my mother, I saw that, oftentimes she was dismissed or not heard or not seen. And in return, I was pretty much invisible. And so that is really, as a young child, seeing those differences and other experiences really drew me to want to make a difference, not only for my mother, but for myself, for my community. And I've told this story before, but at the time, my mom loved like old black and white TV shows, old black and white movies. And when she would come home for lunch during the summertime, Perry Mason would be on. And so you all probably know it from like the HBO, like Perry Mason 2.0, but the original is black and white. And that was my first kind of introduction to the law and what a lawyer does and who a judge is. And just by seeing that show and seeing, cool, suave Perry Mason, get everyone to confess on the stand, I was like, ooh, I want to be Perry Mason. And so he was kind of my idol, I guess, as a young Native girl. But that's really what drove me to want to focus on going to law school and dedicate myself to along the same lines of just making a difference in my own immediate family, but as well as to the larger community. As far as, changed perspectives throughout my career, I started off as an attorney and moved to a judge. So, of course, the dynamics of litigating or advocacy and a judge are certainly quite different. But as it relates to, Indian law, what I've seen since coming to the federal bench and since, some of these cases have been going through the Supreme Court is really the importance of history and historical perspective on these cases and how important it is for federal judges to really understand the broader history of Native American peoples and their interaction with the United States government. And so I think that that's kind of what I'm trying to at least implement, I guess implement's the wrong word, but trying to kind of focus on involving myself in the federal court is to make sure when there is an arena for me, to speak about history and historical perspective and cultural perspective, that I'm able to do so.
And it's my turn. I'm humbled by my colleagues at either side, really. What motivated me to go to law school is I found myself in college in Kansas. And that was too far east for me. I didn't like it there. And I couldn't find a way to get out of there. I couldn't find any work west. I tried to go to South Dakota, Colorado, whatever, Arizona. I couldn't find any work. And so I had some friends who were getting into law schools, and I thought they're pretty smart, but I think I can hang with them. Maybe I should try that out. And that'll be my ticket out of Kansas. Honest to God. And you couldn't have a better setup than I had for the LSAT, because I had been teaching intro to logic for 3 years, and that was like, I ruled the LSAT. And so I got into really good schools, and it came down to this West Coast weather basically that brought me over, that and the loan forgiveness here. The summer after I found out I was getting into law schools and decided to go here, we had a family wedding in South Dakota, and several of my aunties separately brought me over and told me that I would now have an obligation to help the people if I was going to have the power that goes with going to law school. I never knew a lawyer, never met a lawyer, I don't think, before. But they told me, you have to help the people. And I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing now. And I didn't know a lot about law or nothing about Indian law really, other than lived experience, but I couldn't unpack all of that. So I came here and started learning about Indian law, and basically, well, these are the rules. These are the rules of the oppressor, basically, right? Which is what federal Indian law is. It's the rules by which they govern our lives and our families' lives. And that's okay. It's nice to know the rules. And so then start to learn to tinker with the rules. And that became a passion of mine. And some great peers and great people to learn from, great people to look up to when you learn about the work they had done ahead of time. So, it all kind of came together that way. And in terms of changes in perspective over the years, it's tough to unpack what's actually happened in terms of change. I mean, we could cite cases that have been decided over the years. But how do I unpack that from my perceptions and my focus? I have a hard time with that. I mean, stuff is what it is. On the federal Indian law side, the cases come down as they come down, and that probably exists with a pendulum swing between different poles of how people end up, and some of it's helpful to us and some of it's not. Overall, it's not been very helpful over the years, but it's all part of the game, basically, and we're basically trying to help our people live when we work in this area. But on my changes in my perspective, I've determined over time, especially after I did domestic violence work on my home reservation for a while, I just got tired of litigation. I got tired of the fight. I got tired of the bile pulsing through my veins. You get pretty mad doing domestic violence work after a while when you see the same offenders show up time and time again, and you want to start dealing with it. But it's really fun and really rewarding to me to help build things. And so creating space for tribal life ways to operate, to keep setting the boundaries, and then to what can a lawyer do to help feed that so that people can actually reestablish and revitalize their ways of living. And I have the lived experience, the good fortune to have come from a place where culture remained pretty strong. And so I've seen the healing aspects of culture personally. And to see that in other communities has been really rewarding. And to me, it's been about a shift towards that for the most part of my career. But that's all personal. But I still think there's some sort of a tribal renaissance going on. I mean, I think the civil rights movement, the warriors who said that these are legitimate ways and you need to leave, stop impeding or stop infringing on everything. And the space that we've built out since then has given room for people to start recovering and revitalizing their ways of life that they know work. And so some of that's the big trend too, and some of it's just like my eyes opening up and my development and growth over the years.
Thank you all so much for sharing. So we have like a good list of questions, and we'll have a few just for a few. You also jump in whenever you want. Obviously, we can be fluid and fun. So this is specifically for you, Rick, and then for Judge Sykes. What was your experience as a native law student when you were here at Stanford Law? And specifically, were there any experiences, people, events, or lovely things we'd love to hear about?
Surely. one thing I want to say, because I'm afraid I'll forget to make the point later. So, and just hearing both of my fellow panelists up here talk goes back to kind of the original point I made about, or raised about addressing changes that can be made systemic. I think of a couple of things. When I was a student here, and after I graduated, I clerked. I clerked in the Ninth Circuit for Judge Dunaway, who was actually a Stanford graduate, very distinguished graduate of Stanford, a member of the Board of Trustees of Stanford at the time, et cetera. And that was fine. I understand that, but I look back on it, and I think it's kind of an add-on, and I distinguish that from what Sunshine referred to in being a federal judge. That is a systemic change, I think, in ways that clerking for the Ninth Circuit was not. So that is something going from point A to point B that is different. And then Brett made the same point in terms of his work in setting up systems that are different, that create space for certain kinds of things to happen. That again is systemic, and I think that's important. But back to the question, it was different then, honestly. I, in error, actually thought that at the time in 1968, when I came to Stanford, that I was, except for a Cherokee who showed up in the late 19th century and who had been a student at Stanford Law School, that I was the next Native person to come along. And only was informed later in a very gentle and humorous way that I was wrong about that, because I ran into a member of the Hopi family, Piestewas, Bob, and I made some reference in public to the fact that that's what my role had been, was to be sort of the first in the door. And he said, well, no, you really weren't. You got there in 68. I was there in the mid-50s. You should just know that. So I took that in, but that said, it was different then. In 1968, I remember coming in, and this person long ago left Stanford, and I would not mention his name in any event, but somebody in the admissions office had sort of a meeting with me after I first got here, where I was talking about scholarship aid or something with him, and he was asking about my own background, and I of course referred to the fact that I had been I was a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma, and that I had just come from being in graduate school in another university in the East, et cetera. And he was sort of ticking through things, and he said, well, I'm kind of interested in the fact that you're Native or Native American, but that of course is not why you're here. That's irrelevant to your being here. And what he meant was this sort of veil of invisibility, which still sat with the Native community, this we them kind of thing, and I didn't cotton to that line of reasoning, quite frankly. And that's sort of the way it was throughout the university, throughout Stanford. The early 70s were when Stanford first began recruiting undergraduates on a systematic university-wide basis. And it was actually, I think in 71 or 72, that the first large class of Native students came into the university. And quite frankly, it was a disaster. The graduation rate on a 5-year basis was about 20%. And that's because the systems were not in place to support Native students in the way that they are supported now at Stanford. And that was, of course, true at the law school too. And so it was not an overtly, explicitly hostile atmosphere, but it was sort of an unknowing atmosphere. There was no particular importance attached to the fact that my roots were what they were. We immediately set about trying to do certain things in a modest way for the times, I suppose. One of the people most helpful to me then was a gentleman named Felton Henderson, who was one of the associate deans. And he was the one who put in place the first large scale, consistent efforts to recruit both Chicanas and African Americans into the student population of Stanford. And I did sit with him at the end of my first year to see what could be done about trying to bump up the recruitment of Native students into the population. He picked it up quite readily and sort of made it part of the system at Stanford at that point of recruitment. And in my third year class, there were actually 3 Native students who came in the year right after I graduated. And so those kinds of things were happening. And there's a big difference, I think, between then and now. I think that Stanford learned a lot of lessons, just even beyond the law school, that took universities a long time to learn in terms of what's required, in terms of how the system operates when you're trying to bring those who have not been in this place historically to being in this place in the present and for the future. And I credit the university for that. It may be imperfect. It's always a work in progress, but I think that there is significant progress that has been made in that regard since the fall of 1968.
Well, I think I agree with a lot of, what was said, in that when I was at Stanford, I think a lot of focus as well was on recruitment. And I think it's still the same today. So some things have changed and some things haven't. And I think that's something that I think each Native student that goes through Stanford Law School is always kind of thinking about, is how can we bring more Native students into Stanford? How can we get more Native students to apply? How can we recruit more Native students to choose to come here and make it an environment that they want to come to Stanford? Because there's, clinics dealing with Indian law, there's Native professors, there's other types of classes and experiences that Native students want to participate in. So I think that's something that has been a focus throughout multiple generations here at the law school. When I was a student here, I had been here as an undergrad, and I did take a year off, but I stayed in the Bay Area. I worked at California Indian Legal Services, so I still had friends that were in undergrad when I came to law school. So I think my experience was a little different in that my whole focus when I was at the law school wasn't necessarily with at the law school, because I spent a lot of time with my undergraduate friends. And I also had a cousin who attended undergrad and lived at Muwekma. So I spent some time with her as well. So my experience is a little different, but I do say there was about a handful of Native students here. I did connect with them. We connected as much as we could. We were able to bring the Navajo Nation Supreme Court in to do oral argument here at Stanford, which was a wonderful experience, not only for the Native students, but for the larger community as a whole. And it was great to have the Supreme Court here conducting oral argument. We also, I participated in the NALSA Moot Court, and the year I participated, it was in Hawaii, which was great. So that was probably one of my most fondest experiences. Didn't win anything, but I got to go to Hawaii.
You won.
That's true, I won. And I had my daughter, I have 4 daughters, and my oldest daughter, I had her my 3rd year of law school in October. So I spent my 3rd year, taking care of my daughter and trying to manage classes and do everything that you need to do to graduate from law school. So I do think, though, that because the Native community was so small at the law school, I really kind of ventured out to get the support that I wanted at the law school, but from the larger university. So I spent my time at the Native American Cultural Center as opposed to, you know, here in the law school. I spent my free time with individuals from over there as opposed to here because there wasn't, I felt, a lot of support here during the time I was in law school. And we kind of just had to find our own path and kind of had to find our own way. At least that was my experience. I can't speak for everyone else's experiences. One of the things I talk about now is, you know, I didn't even know what a clerk was really until I became a federal judge. And, you know, which is crazy, but it wasn't something that, you know, we were being, you know, what a clerkship is was being brought to the Native students, you know, Native students, you know, why don't you come and learn about what clerkships are? Why don't you, you know, come in and learn about how important it could be, not only to your career, but to your community. And it was just something that it was there, but I would have had to find it myself. And maybe that's just the nature of law school, but I think that there's a lot that can be done in that respect, is to make sure that everyone is aware of opportunities here back when I was here, and something that I think we can always strive to do better to ensure that opportunities are open for everyone and that everyone is aware of those opportunities. So I think mine was just a little bit different, and you were here when I was in undergrad. I think
Yeah.
you graduated, so I don't know how your experience
So
was.
my coping mechanism was the same as yours, really. I relied on the Native Center as all of my support for the most part. I mean, there were a few Native students. There were supposed to be 9 in my class, but there was 3 of us who were involved at all in Alpha. The rest probably checked boxes. And we fought against that. We tried to go to admissions and say, look, if you want Native students here, why is it? It's probably because they would contribute to the diversity of the incoming class, right? Well, you need to evaluate whether they're bringing something about nativeness to the diversity or not, right? And if they don't, that's fine too. But to claim 9 box checkers as 9 natives is not contributing to the diversity. And so I, with my half time, sometimes living on the reservation, and my classmate Hillary, who's talking tonight, with her adoption into a kind of a rainbow family, but then finding her roots later on and going back to Navajo and spending some time living there and working before she came to law school, we contributed to the diversity, and that's about it. Another classmate of ours was from Yurok and spent some time on the reservation at Yurok too, but basically so, you know, that wasn't much contribution. So we fought against that, and I think that fight still goes on. And what else about my experience is relevant? The year before I came, Colin Hampson and Wilson Pipestem had put together a survey of Native American common law, where they brought in different guest lecturers. And that was a pretty neat model. It was kind of cool to see what they had done. So that was a big, exciting thing. At the time, they would teach us federal Indian law if we had sufficient students, if we would get commitments from enough students to have it taught. And so my first year, Abby Epinanti came and taught, and it was a great class. She was really scary. Really scary.
She's still scared.
And I swear she was harder on the Native students, but I'm not sure. But we really had to work. You can come to know her later. She's a beautiful person, and one of the people I look up to most in all of this work. But I was scared of her then. And that was what she presented. And then the next thing we had was Native American common law. It was really Navajo common law. We brought in Justice Raymond Austin from the Navajo Nation Supreme Court, and he taught us for a semester and learned all kinds of Navajo concepts. He paid a lot of attention to making sure that we would start to understand the key language terms, because that's how you really get into that thinking, right? And he also brought in the Navajo Nation Supreme Court to hear a case here then. Do you remember that one? You would have been a junior probably.
Maybe.
It was
Not
all,
sure.
yeah. And then he also brought in the head peacemaker. Navajo Nation has its own peacemaking program, and I had taken a year of mediation here, which was innovative at the time. But then when we learned about peacemaking, it's like, oh, this is really cool. So that I followed that thread the rest of my career, really. But that was the stuff that we did that's of note, I guess, during my run.
And the university, I mean, the law school is always open to that. So for all of you students, come up with ideas. I mean, I think the law school was really open to ideas, at least when I was here.
Yeah.
If we had wanted to do something, they would help us to get it done.
Well, it reminds me of something that I did forget, and that is that even in the year that I was here, it was my third year, we managed to get the first Indian law course here taught.
Who taught that? Do you know?
Oh,
Ah,
I should know his
sorry.
name. He was a law professor from UCLA whom we
Oh,
flew
wow.
up here. If you said his name, I'd remember it, because he was involved in doing a couple of revisions of the handbook on federal Indian law, Cohen's book.
Wow.
But that speaks to another point, though, and that's that if you're looking, I remember for a while, I sat on the board of trustees of Stanford. And I was always interested both in recruitment, but recruitment not only of students, but of professors, and getting them integrated getting them into the faculty. And so we were successful in getting that class. And I think that what you just heard is how that's expanded into much more territory now in terms of what is available. But it was not until a year or two ago that the first professor came here, who was a tenure track professor. And then much more critical.
We can speak firsthand to how important it is to have a faculty here, so definitely echo that. I guess, and this question is more for Judge Sykes and Brett, but again, feel free to jump in. But going off of perhaps your experiences at SLS and also these themes of, systemic change, we note that all the panelists have taken kind of different career paths after law school, and would love to hear more about kind of the decision-making processes and how you kind of saw your legal careers as the paths to how you wanted to practice federal Indian law or practice law.
I think like I said before, I really had my eyes set on, becoming a lawyer from a very young age, and then eventually becoming a judge. I can say that I didn't make my career choices with the intent of becoming a judge, because if you look at what I did before I became a judge, it's a career that's traditionally not a career that leads up to becoming a judge. Oftentimes state court judges, I was a state court judge for 10 years before I came to the federal bench. But oftentimes state court judges who are appointed by the governor or they run through an election are either, most of the times, district attorneys, or they are litigators that have been trial litigators. I came from public interest. I worked at California Indian Legal Services. I did a lot of work like Brett and domestic violence issues in Native communities, urban and rural communities. I also did most of my career was spent in juvenile dependency court. I was an attorney not only for tribes, but I represented parents, I represented kids. Then I went over to represent the Department of Public Social Services. And so through that work, I began to train on issues involving the Indian Child Welfare Act, because as a juvenile dependency attorney, I saw that for the most part, most of the attorneys and the judges thought of ICWA as just another step in the process, something that we got to do it, it's annoying, but we have to do it, and didn't really understand the reason behind the act, but they just thought of it as something like another hurdle that they had to jump, hoop that they had to jump through. And, being Native and really kind of understanding the history and understanding the reason behind the act, and having grandparents who went to boarding, were forced to go to boarding school, and knowing the history, I felt it, upon myself to really make an effort to teach and to educate as to the reason behind the act. And that's where I go back to what I said before is history, having a historical perspective and teaching that history, not only to social workers, but also to judges and to attorneys. And then I started to see once these people are taught the history and, you get them into spaces in which, you're even having them reflect on, okay, imagine you're at home with your children and you're sitting around the table and someone comes and just takes your kids away, and they're gone and you have no idea where they are. And just like getting people to understand that and feel that, it just changes a lot of people's perspective on, okay, this is a law, there's a reason behind it, and this is why we need to follow it. It's not just another red tape. There's a reason that this was passed. There's a reason that it's important that Native children stay with Native families and in their own communities. And, so that is one of the paths that I took. And once I kind of got into that arena, I saw that, well, these judges that are making the decision, none of them are Native. And there has never been a Native judge in the community that I was at. And I said, well, that's not right. There needs to be a different perspective. There needs to be some judges that actually, understand. And that's really what drove me to want to become a judge in the community that I was in. And then fast forward, saw the same thing on the federal court. Wait, there's no Native ever in the state of California on the federal court. Well, California has a large number of Indian law cases that not only come out of California at the district court level, but then go into the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit has the largest number of federal Indian law cases in the whole country. So just seeing that lack of representation and the need for that is really kind of what guided me and drew me to want to take that next step.
Awesome. I've already talked a little bit about my career journey, but just to summarize and try to think about how to answer this thing to be helpful to you all, I've followed my curiosity a lot, and it's been really a nice ride. I've had a lot of fun. It seems, and some of the work, it seems like the world responds if you keep your heart right. If you take a Native approach to it, funding will show up. I'm never going to get rich, but the funding shows up to do some of the best work. And so trusting your faith has been important. And then something Sunshine just said made me want to, what is that? Made me want to point out that we bring a lot of strengths from our cultures. And when we use those strengths, even in the mainstream, they work still because they're about how to deal with people with mutual respect. So I heard Sunshine talking about explaining to people who were originally in opposition about things like ICWA and why does it matter, and giving them the respect and letting them maintain the dignity. Instead of fighting them, she took them as a human and she gave them what they could to make decisions. And so that's how a Native person makes differences in the big system outside. And I think I've tried to do that as well whenever I could. And I love working in those kind of assumptions. And so that's why I've kind of stuck on the development with tribal people, what they want to develop, but it's really essential that people are on the outside doing that translation like that too. In addition to the fighters who, when you have to fight, you want good fighters also, but we have strengths that we bring to the whole thing like this. And, other like mainstream courts adopting peacemaking, there's all sorts of things we can bring forward. And that's a switch that's happened. And I think you all can take advantage of that, and you can follow your curiosities and interests even more probably. So looking good.
Go for it.
If I could just add, this is sort of partly question 4, where my name does appear, I guess. Yeah, okay. But it's partly 3 too. And it's I will say that when I was still practicing law actively, one of my frustrations was not, it was sort of a big picture frustration, not sort of an individual, smaller, specific occasion frustration. And that was, and since it's been mentioned, I will use it as a kind of a continuing example, ICWA. ICWA was basically a piece of legislation that was developed at the behest of an organization called the Association on American Indian Affairs, based in New York. At the time, the general counsel to AAIA was Fried Frank, the firm that I worked for. And we spent all kinds of time trying to get that legislation passed. And so I will say that the frustration sometimes was not being able to achieve what you really felt was something that would alter the territory in a kind of systematic way, as Sunshine has described. That piece of legislation did. And then subsequently, I was involved along with other attorneys who were facing it on a local level too, in defending that piece of legislation, which the constitutionality of which was challenged. It was challenged in the state of Oklahoma. And I argued in front of Oklahoma courts about the constitutionality of that piece of legislation. And then ultimately, it of course came to the Supreme Court itself and was upheld. And I was kind of shocked, quite frankly, that it was upheld in this Supreme Court, but it was. And so that's sort of the, you know, it's that kind of frustration that I felt sometimes. But it leads to another point, and this I want to be sure I say it carefully, and it certainly is not meant as at all any kind of disrespect to Stanford or having a legal education. But I have always seen a legal education as not necessarily an end in itself, but a means to an end. Because as I said earlier, it kind of teaches you about a particular part of the systematics of this country and how they can affect Native people. And that's how I've kind of always explained when I get questioned on both sides of it. How on earth did somebody with even a Stanford legal education become the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian? That's a nonsense. There are personal reasons it wasn't. I mean, my dad, that's the Native side of my family. My mom was non-Native, but my dad was a well-known Native visual artist, a painter and a sculptor. And so it was in my genes in a way. It didn't just fall out of thin air. But it is to say that, again, it was sort of having a legal education and figuring out what both the potentialities of success as well as the frustrations of trying to work in that field made me understand the clarity of, on the one hand, beginning a career in the legal field, which was aimed at protecting the constitutional and legal prerogatives of Native communities as polities and self-governing institutions politically. You realize what's really at issue there, because in a respect, what you're trying to do is use that particular lever to protect these communities as cultural entities. And I saw museums as being directly fastened to that question. And that is what led me to go from one place to the other. And that is what I mean when I say that a legal education can be a blessing in a number of ways, but one of them is that it causes you to sort of appreciate the scope of everything socially and culturally, and can take you from one place to another with great facility. And I attribute my ability to do that from the fact that it actually began at Stanford Law School, even though it ended up by being the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian. It all ties together.
Thank you so much. I think we'll open up to questions from the crowd now, if we'd like. And we have our microphones. Annie will so kind. We have two.
This on Zoom, so we just want to make sure we have it recorded on the mic.
Professor.
Hey guys. Students as well. So a lot of the people in this room have taken federal Indian law from either myself or Professor Oblabsky, or in my class right now. And I think just yesterday, I made a comment about one of the cases that we were teaching, and I was saying, oh, imagine if I was, we were teaching this, this case the year this was decided, yes, it would have been, shocking or frustrating to see some of these doctrinal changes that seem to sort of pop up out of nowhere and have these massive effects on Indian country and within Indian law doctrine. And so my question, which leads me to my question, which is, are there particular moments that you guys remember over the course of the time you were at law school or any of the time since then, where, a big Indian law case was decided and your legal education and perspective on really sort of what that sea change was, made you sort of pause or experience that in a different way than you might have if you hadn't gotten a Stanford legal education?
I can think of a couple, just off the top of my head. And part of it's because being the octogenarian on this panel, I remember when the Supreme Court could be relied upon to chart new territory rather than trying to retract. And that is that a number of cases that I remember very well working on were some of the tax cases that came out of the 70s and 80s, where it was a rather ringing affirmation in ways that we had not seen with that kind of clarity about jurisdictional authorities of tribes. And it's what drew me to going to law school to begin with, because that was already sort of happening at the time when I was first trudging through grad school in American history elsewhere. And I really wanted to be much nearer to that kind of thing. Another one, which was very interesting to me, was a voting rights case. And I remember this, it involved Navajo. I can't quite remember the name of the Navajo official who was involved, but it was a voting rights case of that basically had been litigated by Felix Cohen himself. And when I was assigned to work on the case, I was sent to the archives of Free Frank to do my work. And it was basically reading through briefs that Felix Cohen had written in the late 1940s in both Arizona and New Mexico, when they were trying to shut down the right of Navajos to vote in state elections. And it was taking those cases and using them as the defense to what was being done in the 1970s to try to sort of have a second time around that racetrack. And they came out in our favor. And, the right to vote is sort of fundamentally, it's just right next to the core of this entire country. And so that was another one where I thought, well, it does work sometimes. And this was one of the times that it worked. And that was, to me, a rather special moment.
Tying it back to the Stanford education is difficult. I mean, there's Supreme Court cases that stand out. ICWA's upheld. I was shocked to see. That's the most impactful case in terms of couldn't believe it happened. The machinations in Oklahoma around, is it Indian country or not? And when Castro Huerta finally came down, despite having lived through a string of cases eroding tribal sovereignty and sovereign immunity over decades, really it's been now, I was still shocked by how ugly that Castro Huerta was after it. It was like a bait and switch or something, right? So, But those are the ones that stand out for me. It's not
Yeah,
that responsive to you, but those have been the most impactful. Otherwise, it's been that string through the course of my career. I mean,
yeah, yeah. But I remember talking to Browning. I've seen way back when, the father of of another law student at Stanford about that. And Browning Pipeson was talking about the McGirt result 40 years ago, quite frankly. And living in Oklahoma, which is strange Indian territory. It was, it's interesting, though. It was the right legal result as far as I'm concerned. But the results of which were expected by neither side. And so it has been absolute unmitigated chaos ever since then, on both sides, both the tribal side and the state side. And as an Oklahoman, I regret seeing it sort of evolve into that kind of situation. But that's right. I mean, in terms of expected results, and then having the son of one of my least favorite directors of EPA, who was his mother, be the person who upheld the native position was shocking to me, but it did happen. And then I think ICWA is the same. I would never have predicted that they would decide that. Yeah.
I'll pass.
you gotta watch it, huh? I forget about that.
She's been careful. As you probably should be.
We'll take any more questions from
Yeah.
the crowd. Don't be shy.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Something that I really enjoyed hearing more about in your panel discussion was the ways in which you bring your culture into your practice. And I guess I'm curious to know a little bit more, especially for Judge Sykes, like in a space that is so male dominated, so sort of white dominated, how do you bring your culture and your tradition into the way that you practice, whether that's, introducing, yourself in your native language or anything else that kind of comes up in your sort of everyday experience, because I know you're not always working with native judges and attorneys. And I'm just curious to know a little bit more about that.
Or ever, really.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's kind of a difficult question in that it's hard to kind of separate just who I am as a native person, as a woman, as a judge from itself. I think it comes out in my perspective and how I view things and how I go about just in my day-to-day functioning in court, as well as just with my staff, with my law clerks. With my law clerks, one of the things I've started doing is every year when I onboard new law clerks, we go to a local powwow so that they can kind of experience what that is and eat native food and, experience, a little bit of our culture. I, just talk to them, just who I am and where I come from and just how I try to live my life, in balance and not only, dedicate myself to all the work I have, but also try to maintain to ground myself. And I talk about with them ways in which how I accomplish that. For me, it's, going on a hike or being outdoors or, making sure to have some quiet time or some time for reflection, being grateful. And so just the way I function, I guess, brings in that perspective. I think the way it can play out in regards to my cases is that, and it's not necessarily based upon me solely just being native, but also where I come from and how I grew up. So for instance, in criminal cases, when I have to sentence someone for a violation of supervised release, And, you know, they're telling me how they're struggling with this or that or the other. And I can, you know, I can understand that perspective of, you know, I'm just trying to work, but then I have my children and then you're making me go test like 2 hours away, but I'm going here and I'm just, you know, so like, I understand what that means. So for me, it's like, okay, I understand. What can we do to help you? As opposed to maybe someone else who doesn't come from that background or doesn't understand that would be like, well, you just got to get it done. Like, I don't care. Like, that's too bad. So I think it gives me a little bit more of a different perspective and perhaps empathy, to not just want to punish, but also try to get to like the root of what's causing these individuals to violate, or what can we do to help them so that they don't have to come back into the system. And that's something I think is a little different for me when I handle my criminal cases, is just to have that perspective and belief that, you know, people aren't necessarily bad. They just have made bad choices. I mean, there are some that are, but you know, there are a lot of them that aren't. So.
I would just say that there are two ways in which I would reflect upon what you asked. One is that even though in life as a lawyer, I was not a trial lawyer, but I was an appellate litigator for the most part, in terms of court time. But having said that, I will say that if you've ever looked at some of the literature on Cheyenne legal systems, there was nothing adversarial about them. That wasn't our system. We couldn't afford to have that be our system because we were very small communities from an anthropological standpoint, and we had to have a mediating mentality in terms of trying to work through quote legal problems. And so I think that had an impact upon how I looked at particular cases that were actually right in front of me, or advice that we were giving to, when I was a lawyer, giving to tribal communities about how their own incipient legal systems were constructed to work, that was an ethic that that permeated what they were trying to do. And so that's a way in which my own cultural background had some relationship to what I did as a lawyer. The other thing I will say is that it again, because I'm Cheyenne, it had a definite impact, a long-lasting impact upon working with women. Cheyennes are matrilineal. And I'll never forget that my father, the night I got married, had this conversation with me at the wrap-up dinner or something of the wedding day, and said, he said, "I want to talk to you for a minute." And so I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, are you going to make this work? Are you going to, you got to work at this, you got to make it work." And I said, "That's a strange thing to say to somebody on his wedding night." Do my best. And he said, "Because remember, it is your belongings that will be on the teepee stoop, not hers." And that's because among Cheyennes, because we were matrilineal, women own all the property. And in Cheyenne society too, the women's societies were every bit as important as the men's societies, warrior societies, all kinds of societies. And so that sort of came together, the two things I'm mentioning, when I was the director of the NMAI. For one thing, I never had a senior management team that was less than about 2/3 women, not men. And in terms of how we managed ourselves, it was very much on a non-adversarial who's right, who's wrong basis than it was on what is it that we can say to one another that brings us to a common conclusion. And that's cultural impact.
I'd say that I've said a lot already about integration of culture, and I'm lucky that I get to work with people who are living their culture and trying to bring it forward. But something that I think has really been helpful to me is a lot of focus on consensus-based decisions and the strength of consensus. And that's something that a lot of people aren't like pre-programmed to seek or to try to go for. And so that's something that one can add to pretty much most situations, really. Yeah. And then the gender thing, I mean, it's pervasive, but if you're from a tribal culture, maybe lucky from the right one, you understand that there's, right, it's not male domination. And there's no place for it, really.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Pedro Gonzalez. I just wanted to thank all of you for working with us over the last few years, NALSA for letting us be part of this celebration. Judge Sykes, the question you answered about how you bring kind of your culture and you to your work, I got to experience that firsthand with my parents at your lovely investiture ceremony, where I think it was just amazing to see how hard the Navajo Nation rolled out for you. And it was a beautiful reception. But you all have given us a lot of your time over the last few years. NALSA's been great partners in voicing some of the needs of the community. And now 50 years into the existence of NALSA, what are some things that you would like to continue to see in the connections between students, alumni, and or why do you continue to contribute your time to these efforts?
Well, I hope to see just continued growth. And I think we have grown a lot over the years. I hope to see more Native professors, more Native classes, more Native clinics, more Native outreach, more Native students. And I think that's the hope all around. And, students coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different experiences, different tribes that just bring different things, diversity to the table. I think for myself personally, it's always been important for me and ingrained kind of I think in our culture is, to give back to the community and to not achieve something and then forget who you are and where you come from, but to turn around and bring someone else up with you. And I think that's really been a large part of why ever since I really became a judge, even the state court level of, bringing students into my courtroom. Sherman Indian High School is just down the street in Riverside, and making sure that the Native students, see a Native person as a judge, see a Native person as an attorney, and realize that these spaces are for them. And if they want to go to law school, that is an avenue available to them. If they want to become a judge, that is an avenue available to them. And I think it's important for us as Native people in these careers to make sure that, a young Native girl's, hero isn't Perry Mason, that there's actually someone you can see, and that if you can, the old saying goes, if you can see it, you can be it. And I think that's vitally important. And not only in the legal field, but in all areas of careers across the board. So I think it's an exciting time because there are a lot of Natives in the legal community. There's a lot of good work being done by Native people, where Native people are actually, going back to their communities and representing their own tribes, because historically that hasn't been the case. Native tribes are hiring non-Natives to do their tribal work. And so I think that still is, and Native judges or tribal judges aren't necessarily all Native either. So I think there still is a lot of work to do in that respect of, getting more Native lawyers to go back into their own communities and do that work. Getting more Native lawyers to argue these large cases in front of the circuit courts, in front of the Supreme Court. Having a Native person argue those big cases, I think would be is a huge, success. It'd be a huge deal having someone who comes from that background, comes from that perspective, and is able to advocate for that position. So I think we've done a lot of work, but there's still a lot of good work that can be done to ensure that there's representation across the board.
And I'm trying to focus to Stanford based. I'd like to see more and increased access to communication across the classes across the years of alumni. It's the school is apparently bound by certain privacy considerations that they can't be given out everybody's contact info and everything. Well, we can work around that with time and with effort. We can, like, I'm about ready to start a database. It's not that difficult. It's not too weird of info or whatever, just to contact, but just to increase that communication. The alumni office has been real good about getting us started on this Native alumni group. And it's a start, but I was just talking with a colleague of mine at my work who's not on the list, and she didn't know about this week. And it's like, dang, I wish she was here, because she really rocks the work that she's doing. She's like changing voting in the United States right now. So, we're missing people like that from every decade, I'm sure, more than a decade. So we need to be able to reach each other better still, and we need to build that somehow. And we need the university to help when it can. So having Pedro and staff in their positions is really, it's been awesome. And then also with respect to the students can't access our information very well, but man, and so there's been times when I've been in contact with students, and other times I haven't known anybody. And it has to do with how often can I get here, basically, and meet people. Well, I would like to know every Native student who comes in through here, and I'd like to offer what I've got to share, whatever that might be. And when I'm making money, I'd like to donate so you can go places, right? But we can't even do that. I was asking somebody, is there some way we can donate to NALSA so that you guys can go to Fed Bar and not have to worry? Because we used to like scrape to get, and I guess you get some money now. We had to beg from parents and all of that. But would it be, and even then we knew, like, if we could just talk to alumni, some of them would support us and we wouldn't have to do this, right? So having all of those connections would be really nice. So the more we can build them out, the better. That's my vision. That in a workshop by an institution like Stanford Law School about how to manage outside counsel, because outside counsel rakes tribes over the coals a lot of times in ways that I've seen now, but some voice of authority around that would be really helpful for tribes.
I'll just say amen.
Well, thank you all so much for your insights. We're so grateful to have you all. And for those of us joining tonight, we'll see you all at 5 p.m. on Newcomb Terrace to continue our celebration of 50 years of NALSA. And also powwow is this weekend. So it starts Friday at, I believe, 5. You can check the website at the Arboretum. So make sure to go check that out Friday through Sunday. I guess something cute for yourself. Yes. Thank you all for coming.